In 2003, a French sailor named Olivier Diersos recounted that something stuck to his boat in the middle of the ocean. It was not a distant shadow, nor a fleeting movement under the water. It was contact, weight, resistance. He said he saw a shiny skin, long arms covered in suckers, and a body that, in his memory, measured around 9 meters. For him, it was not a scientific observation, but a scene that did not fit with the normal world. Years later, the most repeated explanation was straightforward. It was probably an architeuthis, the animal the public knows as the giant squid. And although that name sounds definitive, the truth is that even today, the giant squid continues to play the same game as in the legends, appearing at the wrong time, in remote places, and leaving more questions than answers. To understand why, it is better not to start with the monster, but with the building in which it lives. The ocean is not just a horizontal landscape, it is a vertical territory. Above, life is organized around light. Below, it is organized around the absence of light. And in between, there is a boundary that marks a change in rules. The epipelagic zone extends from the surface to approximately 200 meters. It is the lit zone, where the sun's energy enters with enough force to sustain photosynthesis. It is also the place where humans usually believe that the sea is: ships, coasts, storms, visible fishing, animals seen with the naked eye. However, even here the ocean already reveals its first secret. The closer you get to the lower limit of those 200 meters, the more noticeable it becomes that light is not a switch, but a countdown. In the epipelagic zone, life cannot afford to be slow. Everything is exposed. Most predators depend on sight and speed. This makes squids, even the most common seam-engineered, hydrodynamic bodies, powerful muscle tissue, and a movement system that is as simple as it is brutally effective. The squid does not resemble a fish at all. It draws water into its mantle, a kind of muscular bag, and forcefully expels it through a siphon. It is jet propulsion, rapid acceleration, sudden changes in direction, an escape that in many cases lasts seconds, but determines life or death. This way of moving comes at a cost. The squid needs to control its energy expenditure because each explosive escape is a fuel discharge. That is why its true weapon is not always running, but avoiding being seen. Here appears the trait that makes squid so fascinating even in shallow waters: their skin. It is not just skin, it is a screen. Squids can change their color and patterns thanks to specialized cells that expand and contract pigments and structures that reflect light. On the surface, this works as dynamic camouflage, but also as communication. A squid can become sand, rock, shadow. It can turn off parts of its body and turn on others. It can simulate textures, spots, lines. In an environment where everything sees you, the first step to survive is deciding which version of your body is available to others' eyes. The typical scene of the epipelagic squid, and why it appears on reefs, in documentaries, in aquariums, is that of an animal transforming in real time. However, what is truly important for this story is that this visual control begins to change when the squid approaches the lower edge of the epipelagic zone. Because near 200 meters, light becomes scarce, contrast becomes strange, and life adapts to a world where hiding is no longer just camouflage, but a negotiation with darkness. At this point, a key transition appears. Some squids, instead of relying solely on camouflage with external light, begin to produce their own light. It is bioluminescence, not as decoration, but as a tool. And one of the most cited examples to understand this threshold is the firefly squid. It is small, not the giant people imagine, but serves as a perfect symbol of the door that opens. Its body is covered with thousands of light-producing organs called photophores. At night, it rises toward the surface to feed, and this ascent can turn the water into a spectacle of flashes. By day, it descends again to darker zones. It literally lives in two worlds, the upper one where light rules and the lower one where light becomes a scarce tool that must be manufactured. This idea is central to understanding why the deep ocean is connected to the surface. Many animals perform daily vertical migrations. Food is concentrated at the top, but so is risk. So the ocean creates a shift system, the surface as a nighttime dining area, the bottom as a daytime refuge. And although the giant squid is not a typical actor in shallow waters, this logic explains why so many human encounters with strange creatures happen all of a sudden. Because sometimes the animal is not in its place according to our expectations, but fulfilling a cycle we do not see. The epipelagic zone, seen this way, ceases to be a simple initial stage. It is the antechamber. Here, the first tools are trained that are later exaggerated in the depths. Body control, movement efficiency, strategies to deceive the eyes. And most importantly, here the exact point is established where the ocean begins to become another. Because when the 200 meters are crossed, it is not just light that is lost. A whole way of living is lost. From that point on, the sea ceases to be a space to be observed and becomes a space to be guessed. And that change begins exactly where the epipelagic breaks and the permanent twilight of the next layer begins. When we enter the midnight zone or twilight zone, the ocean becomes ambiguous. Light still exists, but it no longer rules. It is a distant glow, a sort of dim ceiling barely enough to outline silhouettes. That is why this band is called the mesopelagic zone or twilight zone. It is not daytime, but it is not total night either. And this ambiguity changes the behavior of everything that lives there. At the surface, an animal can rely on colors, shadows, and landscapes. Down here, the landscape dissolves. There are no clear references, and food is not abundant. It is scattered. Instead of a world full of stimuli, a world appears where the rule is to save energy. Every acceleration costs. Every chase is a risk. Every mistake is paid for with hunger. And in this environment appears one of the most important ideas of the open ocean: vertical movement as routine. Many creatures rise at night when the lack of light protects them from predators that hunt with sight and return downward before dawn. It is as if the entire ocean breathes vertically, a massive ascent when the sun sets, a retreat to the depths when light returns. This daily vertical migration makes the twilight zone not a still place but a corridor through which living food circulates every night. If you think of it this way, the mesopelagic becomes a highway of opportunities. Fish and crustaceans coming and going, shadows appearing and disappearing, bioluminescent flashes that reveal movement. For a squid, this is perfect, because its body is made for two things: reacting quickly and sustaining a close-range fight. This place is the domain of the Humboldt squid, a species that breaks with the elegant image people usually have of cephalopods. In this narrative, the Humboldt does not move like a solitary hunter. It moves like a pack. It coordinates, marks signals on its skin, encircles, overwhelms. It is even described as cannibalistic when food is scarce, as if the pressure of the environment pushes toward a brutal logic. When energy is lacking, the first thing to fall is any kind of social rule. The interesting thing about this image is not just the aggressiveness, but what it implies. In the twilight zone, behavior becomes strategy, and strategy becomes language. Color patterns cease to be simple camouflage and become real-time communication. It is as if, instead of hiding from the world, some squids decide to dominate it through coordination. Now, there is something key in the mesopelagic that explains why this coordination matters so much. Here, sunlight becomes so faint that seeing is no longer an automatic act. It is an extremely costly skill. And when seeing comes at a high cost, two extreme paths appear. Either you produce your own light, or you become an expert at detecting the minimal light in the environment. That is why bioluminescence is not a quaint detail in this zone. It is part of the furniture. Flashes to attract prey, pulses to communicate, lights to confuse pursuers, and perhaps most unsettling, lights to deceive the eyes of others about your real shape. In that dimness, eyes begin to decide everything. Because although it may seem contradictory when there is little light, the large eye does not serve to see better as on the surface. It serves to detect rare events, massive movements, minimal changes in the brightness of the water. And that is where this story connects with the giants. In the twilight zone appears the giant squid, that creature that for centuries lived more in sailors' tales than in evidence. And it is presented not only as long, but as an example of the gigantism of the depths, bodies stretching as if gravity and hunger had negotiated a new form. In this layer of the ocean, the giant would not be a coastal monster. It would be a natural inhabitant of the twilight, designed for a world where light is a scarce resource. But the most powerful aspect of that description is not the length. It is the meaning of its eyes. The giant squid has the largest eyes in the animal kingdom, made to capture every possible photon and to detect both bioluminescent traces and silhouettes of predators against the faint light of the sky. This idea of seeing predators and not just prey changes the entire moral of the myth. Because in that framework, the giant squid is not only the supreme hunter, it is also the prey of something even larger. In the open ocean, the predator that occupies that role is the sperm whale. And here occurs a detail that seems almost like a message. The story is reconstructed not by watching the animals fight, but by seeing the marks they leave. For decades, sperm whales were documented with circular scars compatible with suckers. It is as if the ocean, unable to show us the full scene, provided partial evidence. The winner's body also bleeds. If one pieces these together, the twilight zone ceases to be an intermediate stretch. It becomes a psychological frontier, because it is the first place where the ocean begins to behave like an alien world. Insufficient light, animals that manufacture glow, predators that listen, and prey trying to see minimal flashes kilometers away. And here appears a point that explains why giants were filmed so little for so long. We, as a species, depend on light. Instruments depend on light. Cameras depend on light. In the mesopelagic, any observation is already a negotiation with the environment. Artificial lighting that can scare, noise that can attract, cables vibrating like false prey, baits that turn science into a trap. That is why for years the closest thing to presence of the giant squid was remnants, damaged arms, dying specimens near the surface, beaks found where they shouldn't be. And yet everything points to the same thing. In the twilight zone lies the threshold of a silent war between giants that almost never reaches our view. And now, if the mesopelagic already seems strange, the next descent completely breaks the mental map. Because the descent continues, and without ceremony, twilight ends. From 1,000 meters down, sunlight is no longer a factor. It is not that there is little, there is none. The ocean enters a state of permanent midnight, a world where colors lose meaning and where life no longer resembles what we imagine when we say sea. If the twilight zone was ambiguous, this is definitive. Down here, nature does not rely on sight but on pressure, cold, extreme energy conservation, and the ability to detect minimal signals in an immense space. In the bathypelagic zone, squids seem completely deformed by evolution. And that is a useful way to put it, because what we see in records and captures does not resemble the classic reef squid. There are bodies stretched until they look like threads. There are gelatinous tissues. There are oversized fins. There are eyes that seem impossible. And above all, there are creatures so strange that modern humans know them more from a disturbing image on the internet than from a full laboratory study. One of these cases is the so-called human tooth squid. The story is simple and effective. When a specimen was recovered, its mouth seemed surrounded by teeth similar to ours. The image circulated as nightmare material. But the real explanation is more uncomfortable and, in its way, more interesting. They were not teeth. They were soft tissue folds, lips folded around the beak. An anatomical deception that, seen out of context, becomes an instant monster. And that confusion says a lot about this level of the ocean. We are not just seeing strange animals. We are seeing animals out of their environment, lifted into a world that breaks their bodies and alters the way we interpret them. That same account adds a key detail. Only one specimen was captured, tiny, and part of the reason for that uniqueness is not that the animal is an anomaly, but something more basic. At these depths, it is difficult to see. difficult to illuminate, difficult to film, difficult to capture without destroying. And that is why the bathypelagic feels like an incomplete catalogue. We know there is more, but we cannot inventory it comfortably. However, at the other end of the size range, in this same transition toward midnight, appears the name that dominates the collective imagination: the giant squid. Here the narrative changes scale. We are no longer talking about a small, elusive rarity, but an animal whose existence was debated for centuries as if it were a myth, until the remains began to accumulate in a way science could not ignore. It is the clearest example of deep-sea gigantism, a body that can exceed 13 meters from head to the tip of the tentacle, with a maximum real size still debated due to the scarcity of complete specimens. But the important thing is not just how long it is, but what traits make it the perfect inhabitant of midnight. First, the eyes. In a world without sun, eyes are not for admiring landscapes, they are for detecting events. And the giant squid, according to descriptions, has enormous eyes, developed to capture every available photon in the darkness. The logic is brutal. When light is almost zero, any clue becomes valuable. A bioluminescent flash, a disturbance in the water, a massive shadow outlined against the faint, distant light of upper layers. Seeing that before the enemy is survival. Next, the body. The mantle is a muscular machine. It is not a sack. It is an engine that allows powerful jet propulsion. In midnight, where long-distance chasing is costly, short bursts of acceleration can be decisive. A quick attack, a capture, a retreat, violent efficiency. And finally, the capture system, 8 arms and 2 longer tentacles covered with suckers. Around those suckers are likely toothed structures that help hold resistant prey. In the center, the chitinous beak, hard, sharp, made to break. Altogether, the image is clear. The giant squid is not a passive ghost of the deep ocean. It is a predator, and its anatomy is designed for close combat, for grappling to turn a brief encounter into an immediate victory. But the most important piece is the context that makes it inevitable. In the midnight of the ocean, there is no room for hesitation. Everything is scarce. Everything costs. Everything resolves quickly. That is why, when it is described as a super predator, it is useful to hold 2 ideas simultaneously. The first, yes, it can hunt smaller fish and squids and exploit almost any opportunity it can catch. The second, its own size puts it in a larger conflict. Because in the deep ocean, the bigger you are, the more likely you are to be on the radar or sonar of something even larger. And there, at the edge of this layer, the story starts to turn again. Because if the bathypelagic is midnight, what comes next is the place where midnight becomes absolute. Below 4,000 meters, we no longer speak of darkness alone. We speak of a world that operates on leftovers, food falling over weeks, organic debris, a slow rain that decides who lives and who does not. Below 4,000 meters, the ocean ceases to feel like a place and begins to feel like a permanent condition. Absolute darkness, enormous pressure, low temperatures, and a silence that is not poetic but physical. In the abyssal zone, there is no day, no horizon, and the idea of a landscape becomes irrelevant. There are no plants because there is no photosynthesis, no new energy enters from the sun. Everything living down there depends on what falls from above, as if the deep ocean were a city surviving on what is thrown from the surface. This slow rain has an almost innocent name for how relentless it is: marine snow. They are organic particles, debris, fragments of life, tiny strands of matter that detach from upper layers and descend for days or weeks. Along the way, this snow thins out because other organisms intercept it, eat it, transform it. When it finally reaches the abyss, it is often the last version of food that has been nibbled multiple times by the food chain. The consequence is direct. In the abyss, life is not lived with abundance. It is lived on a budget. Every movement has a cost, every chase is a luxury, and patience ceases to be a virtue and becomes an obligatory strategy. This is the first point where the popular idea of the squid as a fast, muscular hunter shooting through the water like a bullet begins to fail. Because speed, in a world of scarcity, is not always the answer. That is why some extreme-depth squids seem designed to contradict our expectations. Extremely long, thin bodies, almost gelatinous tissues, shapes that do not pursue but maximize efficiency. Some species, more than swimming, seem to float. More than hunt, they seem to fish by extending their arms like lines, waiting for the slightest contact that justifies a brief reaction. It is not that the abyss forbids active hunting, but it transforms it. The predator cannot afford many errors, and therefore nature tests strategies that, seen from above, seem strange or even fragile. Fragility, however, is deceptive. In the deep, being light, soft, or energy efficient can be a superior form of resilience. Now, in the midst of this world that rewards thrift, there exists an animal that breaks the mold in the opposite direction. It is not the longest, it is not necessarily the most spectacular in centimeters, but it is the one that forces a redefinition of the word giant when we talk about squids. The colossal squid, Mesonicoteuthis hamiltoni, is the heavyweight champion. And this distinction matters because for decades the public was trapped in a single image, that of the giant squid as the ultimate ceiling. The reality is more uncomfortable, and for that very reason more interesting. The colossal squid may be shorter in total length than some reports of the giant squid, but in mass and robustness, it is in a different league. It is like comparing a spear with a hammer. One impresses with reach, the other with the sense that it is made to dominate contact. The colossal squid is associated with the Southern Ocean, the Antarctic and subantarctic waters, and here an idea emerges that helps explain its body. Gigantism is not a single thing. In the deep, there exists cold, dark water gigantism, the tendency of certain organisms to grow larger in environments where metabolism slows and competition occurs in rare but decisive encounters. In polar regions, the extreme cold adds another factor, favoring organisms capable of storing energy and sustaining large bodies in an ecology with seasons, migrations, and prey concentrated at certain times. When these two pressures combine, evolution does not just stretch, it densifies. And the colossal seems to respond exactly this way, not only in size, but in weight, muscle, and gripping tools that set it apart even within the world of cephalopods. The anatomical detail that made it famous is as simple as it is disturbing. In its tentacles, there are not just suckers, there are rotating hooks, a structure designed to grab and not let go. This is not an exaggeration. They are real hooks, aligned in rows, and their probable function is to secure prey in an environment where contact may be the only opportunity. In other words, the colossal squid does not need to chase like a sprinter if it can resolve an encounter like a fighter. Ambush, grasp, and control. The image changes completely. It is no longer the kraken that surrounds ships, but a predator that specializes in the exact moment when two bodies touch in the dark. The problem, and this is why we keep getting it wrong, is that almost everything we know about the giants of the deep ocean comes from incomplete evidence. For a long time, the colossal squid was an animal known only through fragments, beaks found in predators' stomachs, isolated tentacles, accounts of accidental captures. And even when a specimen appeared, it often arrived deformed by ascent, by pressure changes, or by its state of preservation. Squids, even the large ones, are soft tissue. The ocean supports them with pressure. The surface punishes them with its absence. Bringing them up is not like lifting a fossilized bone. It is like trying to preserve a damp cloud. That is why the milestone of 2007 became so important. A longline vessel fishing for Antarctic cod in the Ross Sea captured a huge colossal squid. The animal was preserved frozen and ended up in New Zealand at the Te Papa Museum, where it became the world reference specimen. What is fascinating is that even there, with a real body in front of researchers, confusion did not disappear. It changed shape. At first, higher estimates circulated, as often happens when the media world races ahead of the laboratory. Later, with study and controlled thawing, a detail emerged that explains many discussions about how long it really is. The tentacles can shrink after death and during preservation, significantly altering total length. The result was a blow to popular fantasy. The colossal did not need to measure 20 meters to be colossal. Its greatness lay in weight, density, the size of structures like the eye, and the evidence that there are bodies capable of reaching dimensions that, for an invertebrate, seem absurd. This difference between length and mass is one of the most common mental traps on this topic. The giant squid, Architeuthis, usually dominates in the imagination through length, extended tentacles, a silhouette imagined as a living ribbon in the black water. The colossal, on the other hand, forces a different perspective. It is the animal that makes you think in volume, in strength, in biological weight. And when the public hears bigger, they almost always imagine longer. That is where the misunderstanding begins. We measure with a surface-level intuition and expect it to work in an ecosystem where body shape follows different rules. The second reason we get it wrong is even simpler. We cannot see. For centuries, the history of these squids was written from above, with sailors' accounts, occasional strandings, remains recovered by fisheries. The real scene remained out of sight. That is why monsters and krakens appear. That is why any circular mark on a sperm whale becomes evidence of an epic battle no one witnessed. The truth is that those battles do happen, but they do not need mythology to be impressive. A sperm whale dives to hunt in the dark, a squid defends itself with suckers and hooks, and the ocean returns a scarred body to the surface as if subtitles of a movie we never saw. The interesting thing is that technology has slowly begun to break this pattern. In recent years, a major shift has occurred. We no longer rely only on what rises dead. We have begun to look in the right place. A historic example was the confirmed filming of a living colossal squid in its natural environment. Not a giant adult, but a juvenile, recorded by remotely operated vehicles near the South Sandwich Islands at about 600 meters depth. That detail also teaches something. Even when we finally see it, we see only a chapter. The life of the colossal is not summarized in a fixed, immobile, deep-sea monster. It may include juvenile stages in shallower layers, vertical movements and behaviors we still do not fully understand. And that is almost the most valuable part. The first living image does not close the case, it opens it. In the end, the colossal squid functions as a double lesson. First, it forces us to accept that the surface is not the center of the ocean, but its skin, and that much of what is important happens far from our light. Second, it reminds us that the science of the deep sea is, by definition, a science of edges. Technological edges, logistical edges, interpretive edges. On that margin, it is easy to get measurements wrong, to misinterpret accounts, to misread what we see in a fragment. But it is also where the strongest stories appear, because they do not depend on exaggeration. They depend on reality. On a planet that feels increasingly known, there are still enormous animals living in permanent darkness, made of muscle and patience, armed with hooks, surviving on marine snow, falling like dust, and existing as if our gaze were not a requirement for the world to be real.